The rain had started falling just before sunset, thin silver lines against the dark sky. Margaret stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the world outside grow quiet. Her house in Oregon had always been peaceful. A little too quiet since her husband Henry passed away 6 years ago. Tonight, though, it felt different. Her grandson Ethan was visiting for the weekend, and that alone filled the house with a kind of warmth she hadn't felt in years. She could hear the soft sounds of him moving around in the living room, humming a tune as he looked through the bookshelf. He'd always been curious, gentle, but full of questions, much like Henry was at that age. The smell of her apple pie drifted through the kitchen, mixing with the sound of rain, creating that rare kind of comfort she wished could last forever. When she called him for dinner, Ethan came in smiling, his hair a little messy, his eyes bright. They sat at the table across from each other, sharing the kind of simple meal that had always been part of their bond: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables from her garden. Ethan talked about school, about his photography club, and how he wanted to apply to a university in Seattle. His excitement made her heart swell. She remembered Henry's voice in her head, saying how proud he'd be of the boy. After dinner, Margaret poured them both hot chocolate, and they sat on the couch as thunder rolled in the distance. The old house creaked slightly in the wind. On the coffee table lay one of her favorite albums, filled with old black and white photographs. Corners worn and pages yellowed. Ethan reached for it, brushing the dust from its cover before opening it carefully. "Wow," he said softly, looking at the first page. "You looked so different here, Grandma." Margaret chuckled. "That was a long time ago. Your grandpa took that picture the day we got engaged." He flipped the page and smiled at a picture of the two of them by the lake, Henry's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "You both look so happy." She nodded, her voice softer now. He was the kind of man who made everything feel safe. Even silence with him never felt empty." Ethan was quiet for a moment, staring at the photo. The sound of the rain filled the gap between them. Then he looked up and asked, "Do you ever stop missing someone like that?" The question caught her off guard. She wasn't sure how to answer right away. His eyes gray-blue, just like Henry's, met hers, and for a moment she felt as if time had folded back. She took a slow breath. "No," she said gently. "You never stop missing them. You just learn to live with the missing. It becomes part of who you are." Ethan nodded slowly, still holding the photo in his hand. "That sounds hard." "It is," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "But it's also beautiful in a way. Because when you love someone deeply, they never really leave you. They stay here." She touched her heart. He didn't say anything after that, just gave a small nod. But Margaret noticed the look in his eyes, something thoughtful, something older than his years. The kind of expression that made her realize he understood more than most people his age ever could. After a while, Ethan stood and stretched. "I'll clean up the dishes, Grandma," he said. "You don't have to. I want to," he interrupted softly, smiling. "You've done enough." She smiled back. That was Henry's kind of kindness, quiet but full of meaning. She went upstairs to get ready for bed, but as she reached the hallway, she heard him humming again. That same tune as before, his voice calm and steady. It made her stop for a moment and listen. Something about it made her heart ache and warm at the same time. Later, she changed into her nightgown, brushed her hair, and sat by her bedside lamp reading a novel she'd started weeks ago. The words blurred, though. Her mind kept drifting back to Ethan's question. "Do you ever stop missing someone?" She thought of Henry, of the mornings they used to share coffee on the porch, of his laugh, his quiet patience, his way of listening without needing to say much. She sighed softly, closing the book. The rain had calmed outside. The only sound left was the steady ticking of the clock on her wall. A few minutes later, there was a knock on her door. "Come in," she said. Ethan peeked inside. "Are you still awake?" "Barely," she teased, smiling. "What's wrong?" He stepped in, hesitating by the doorway. "Nothing's wrong. I just wanted to ask you something before I go to bed." His voice was calm, but there was something serious in his tone that made her set her glasses aside. "All right, sweetheart," she said. What is it? He sat on the edge of her bed, fidgeting slightly. How did you know Grandpa was the one? The question lingered in the air. Margaret blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected that. The one? She repeated softly. Yeah, he said, his voice lower now. The person you're meant to be with? How did you know? She leaned back, thinking. I think it was the way he made me feel at peace, she said slowly. There wasn't any rush. There wasn't confusion. Just calm. Like I didn't have to pretend to be anyone else when I was with him. Ethan nodded, staring down at his hands. I think I understand that. Her brow furrowed slightly. Do you? He hesitated, then said, There's someone I like. But it feels different from before. It's not just a crush. It feels deeper, and I don't know what to do about it. Margaret's heart softened. She could see how nervous he was, how carefully he spoke. Well, she said gently, if it's real, you'll know. Real love doesn't make you anxious. It makes you grow. It makes you kind. He smiled faintly. That's how it felt with you and Grandpa, wasn't it? She nodded. Yes, it was never perfect, but it was real. There was a short silence. Ethan looked down, then up again, his expression tender. You know, Grandma, he said quietly, you're the reason I believe in love. Because you never stopped loving him. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that kind of honesty. Her eyes welled with tears, and she pressed her lips together, unable to speak for a moment. Then she reached out, took his hand, and squeezed it gently. Thank you, Ethan, she whispered. He smiled, stood up, and said good night before slipping out of the room. The moment the door closed, Margaret sat there in silence, her heart full and trembling at once for the first time in years. She felt seen, truly seen, not as a lonely widow, but as someone whose love had meant something when she finally lay down. She whispered softly into the quiet, Henry, you'd be proud of him. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The moon broke through the clouds, casting a soft silver glow across the room. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled faintly. Somehow she felt Henry's presence again, not as a memory, but as a quiet comfort filling the room. That night she dreamed of the lake, the same one from the old photo. She was there again, young, laughing, holding Henry's hand. But when she looked up, she saw Ethan in the distance, smiling, that same warm smile. And in her heart, she understood, love never ends. It simply finds new forms to live through. That realization stayed with her when she woke the next morning. She didn't know it yet, but that question asked so simply had opened something inside her, a door she didn't know was still locked. And from that night on, Margaret would never look at her grandson quite the same way again. Not because of what he said, but because she saw in him the reflection of everything she had ever loved. The next morning began with soft sunlight breaking through the curtains, filling the kitchen with a golden glow. Margaret woke early, as she always did, and started breakfast. The scent of coffee and butter filled the air. She could hear birds outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator. But mostly, she listened for Ethan's footsteps upstairs. It had become a quiet joy, knowing someone was there again, breathing life back into the house. Ethan came down soon after, his hair still messy from sleep, wearing one of Henry's old flannel shirts she had given him the night before. "Morning, Grandma," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," she replied, smiling. "Sleep well." He nodded and sat at the table. "Yeah, the rain last night was nice. Kind of relaxing. It always was," she said softly, pouring him coffee. "Your grandpa loved rainy nights. He said they made the world feel honest." Ethan chuckled. That sounds like something he'd say. They ate in quiet comfort, scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh orange juice. The radio played old songs in the background, the kind Margaret used to dance to in her younger days. As she moved around the kitchen, she caught Ethan watching her a few times, not out of concern or curiosity, but something else. He looked as though he was studying her, searching for something he couldn't put into words. After breakfast, they decided to go out to the backyard. The storm had washed everything clean, and the air smelled like pine and wet grass. The garden was full of color, roses, lilies, and a few stubborn daisies pushing through the soil. Margaret had always loved her garden. It was her way of keeping life close. "Can I help you with something out here?" Ethan asked. "You can water those plants near the fence," she said. "They've been struggling lately." He nodded and got to work. She watched him for a moment, tall, gentle, patient, and felt that familiar tug in her chest. Henry had looked just like that when he was young, tending to the garden with quiet care. After an hour, they both sat on the old wooden bench by the oak tree. Margaret handed Ethan a glass of lemonade. The sun was brighter now, and the light danced on the leaves above them. "It's beautiful here," Ethan said. "Feels like time doesn't move." "That's what I like about it," she replied. "Out here, everything just is. You don't have to chase anything. You just breathe." He nodded, taking a sip. "I wish life always felt like this." She smiled faintly. "It can, if you choose it to." They sat quietly for a while, listening to the wind. Then Ethan spoke again, his tone softer. "Grandma, can I ask you something personal?" Margaret turned her head slightly. "Of course." He hesitated. "Do you ever get lonely?" Her heart sank a little. It wasn't a cruel question, just honest. She looked at her hands resting in her lap, the thin lines of age marking her skin like stories written over time. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I've learned that loneliness isn't always a bad thing. It gives you space to remember." He nodded slowly. "I think I get that." There was a long pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken things. Ethan seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the distance. Then he turned back to her, his voice lower now, almost uncertain. "Grandma, last night when we talked about love, you said real love makes you calm, right?" "Yes," she said softly. "Why?" He looked down at his hands, fidgeting slightly. "What if you feel that calm with someone you shouldn't?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" He sighed, his words slow. "Like, what if the person who makes you feel that peace isn't someone you're supposed to fall for? What if it's someone unexpected?" Margaret felt something shift inside her. His tone wasn't playful. It was careful, vulnerable. She studied his face, trying to read between his words. "Ethan," she said gently, "love doesn't always follow rules. Sometimes it shows up where we least expect it. But what matters most is how we handle it." He looked at her then, really looked. His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "That's what scares me," he whispered. Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because the person I feel that way about makes me feel safe, makes me feel understood, and I don't want to lose that." His words lingered like echoes. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest and confusion mixed with it. She didn't know what to say right away. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "If it's real, Ethan, you won't lose it. Real love doesn't go away because it's difficult. It finds a way to stay honest." He nodded, still quiet, his gaze softening. "You always know what to say." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's just what comes with time." They stayed like that for a while, side by side under the oak tree. The silence between them no longer awkward, but gentle. The moment carried something unsaid, something that neither of them wanted to break. Later that afternoon, Lee drove into town. Margaret needed groceries, and Ethan offered to come along. The small town looked peaceful as ever. Quiet streets, familiar faces, the same old bakery still selling its warm loaves. People greeted Margaret kindly, some calling her Mrs. Lawson out of habit. Ethan carried the bags while she chatted with the cashier. On the drive home, the sky began turning golden again. Ethan rested his arm on the open window, letting the wind tousle his hair. "You know," he said suddenly, "you make things feel simple, Grandma. Like life doesn't have to be so heavy." She chuckled softly. "Life is only heavy if you hold on to too much of it. You learn to let go little by little." He turned to her, smiling. "That's hard for me. It's hard for everyone," she said gently. When they reached home, the air had cooled. They put away the groceries and made dinner together. A slow, quiet process filled with soft laughter. The smell of baked bread and herbs filled the kitchen again, just as it had the night before. As evening settled, they went to the porch to watch the sunset. The horizon burned orange and pink, and the last light of the day rested on their faces. Margaret looked at Ethan, noticing how calm he looked. His expression had a kind of peaceful seriousness she hadn't seen before. "You've grown so much," she said. He smiled. "You make it sound like I'm already old." She laughed. "You'll get there sooner than you think." He leaned back, looking at the sky. "I don't know if I want to grow up," he said. "It feels like the older you get, the more you lose." Margaret shook her head. "No, Ethan, you don't lose, you just trade things. You give away what you don't need anymore to make room for something new." He was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You really believe that?" "With all my heart," she replied. For a while they just sat in silence, the soft sound of crickets filling the air. Then Ethan turned to her again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma, can I tell you something without you thinking it's strange?" She nodded gently. "You can tell me anything." He hesitated, eyes flickering down, then back up. "You're the person who makes me feel that calm I was talking about." Margaret froze, not out of discomfort, but out of surprise. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. But there was no malice, no confusion, only truth. The kind of truth that came from deep emotion. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it over his. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice warm. "That calm you feel, it comes from love, but not the kind that confuses or hurts. It's the love that reminds you you're never alone. That's what family is." He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I think I understand." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Good, because that kind of love is the strongest kind of all." The sky faded into twilight, and stars began to appear one by one. Ethan leaned his head back against the chair, watching the night unfold. Margaret sat quietly beside him, her heart full, not from the words that had been said, but from what they had meant in that stillness. She realized something profound. The connection between generations wasn't just blood. It was emotion, memory, and the way love carried itself forward. Ethan wasn't just her grandson. He was a reflection of every lesson, every tenderness she and Henry had ever shared. That night, when Ethan finally said goodnight, she stayed on the porch a little longer, listening to the sound of the crickets. She thought of the past, not with sadness, but with gratitude, because now she understood something she never had before. Love doesn't fade, it transforms. It moves from one heart to another, shaping new stories, healing old wounds, and teaching new ways to care. And as the moon rose above the trees, Margaret whispered softly into the quiet night, "Thank you, Henry. He's everything we hoped he'd be." Then she went inside, smiling, knowing the story of love wasn't over. It was only changing its form. The next morning, the sky was soft gray, with a light drizzle tapping against the kitchen windows. Margaret stood by the counter, making tea. The quiet of the house was peaceful, not empty, but calm, filled with a gentle rhythm of rain and the faint scent of cinnamon toast. Ethan was still asleep upstairs, and she let him rest. He had looked thoughtful the night before, like he was carrying something inside he wasn't ready to say aloud. When he finally came downstairs, his hair messy and eyes heavy with sleep, she greeted him with her warm smile. "Morning, sweetheart. I made tea." "Thanks," he murmured, taking a seat. He looked distracted, staring at the steam rising from his cup. She watched him quietly, sensing he was deep in thought. After a while, he said softly, "Grandma, can I ask you something again?" Margaret smiled gently. You don't have to ask to ask." He took a deep breath. "Do you ever regret anything? Like choices you made, things you said or didn't say?" Her hand paused over her teacup. The question hit deep. "Yes," she said finally. "I think everyone does. Even the happiest people have a few what-ifs tucked away. But regrets are like shadows. They only grow if you keep staring at them." Ethan nodded, but didn't look up. "I think I've been staring at mine too long." She leaned forward, her tone soft but firm. Then maybe it's time to face them, not to change the past, but to understand it. He looked up, his eyes a little misty. I wish it was that easy. Margaret smiled faintly. Nothing worth healing ever is. The rain outside grew stronger, the sound filling the quiet between them. She reached over and touched his hand, a simple gesture that grounded both of them. You're young, Ethan. You still have time to fix things, to speak what's in your heart before it's too late. He nodded again, but didn't reply. Instead, he looked out the window, lost in the gray morning light. Later that day, the rain cleared, and the air smelled fresh again. They decided to go for a drive to the lake, a place Margaret hadn't visited in years. It was about 30 minutes away, surrounded by tall pines and soft hills. Ethan drove, and she watched him from the passenger seat, remembering the days when she and Henry made the same trip, their laughter filling the car when they arrived. The lake was calm, reflecting the cloudy sky like glass. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and earth. They walked along the wooden dock, the boards creaking under their feet. Margaret stood at the edge, closing her eyes for a moment. I used to come here with your grandfather, she said softly. He said this place made him feel small, in a good way, like the world was reminding him to slow down. Ethan looked at her, then out across the lake. I can see why. It's peaceful. She smiled. Peace is a rare thing these days. People chase noise, thinking it'll fill the quiet inside them. But the quiet's where you find yourself. For a long moment they just stood there, listening to the wind ripple across the water. Then Ethan took a slow breath. Grandma, he said quietly, there's something I need to tell you. Her heart quickened. The tone of his voice was serious, almost trembling. What is it? He hesitated, struggling to form the words. Last night when I said you make me feel calm, I wasn't just talking about comfort. I meant that you remind me what love really is. The kind that doesn't ask for anything, that just exists. Margaret looked at him, really looked. His expression was raw, filled with emotion he couldn't contain. She placed a hand gently on his cheek, her voice trembling slightly. Oh, Ethan, she whispered. That's the kind of love that saves us. Not the kind that takes, but the kind that teaches. He blinked back tears. I think I needed to hear that. She smiled through her own emotion. We all need to hear it sometimes. They stood there side by side, the lake shimmering beneath them. It wasn't a moment of sadness or confusion. It was something deeper. Two souls generations apart, understanding that love comes in many forms. Some spoken, some simply felt. When they got home, the evening light poured through the windows, golden and gentle. Margaret started preparing dinner, and Ethan offered to help. They moved around the kitchen in quiet harmony, as if they'd done this together for years. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace. Ethan lit it carefully, and soon the flames flickered across the room, casting warm light on their faces. The sound of crackling wood filled the air. Do you ever think about what happens after we're gone? Ethan asked suddenly. Margaret nodded. Sometimes. But I think what really matters is what we leave behind. The love, the kindness, the stories. That's what keeps us alive in the people who come after. Smiled faintly. You talk about love like it's the air we breathe. Maybe it is, she said. You don't always see it, but you feel it everywhere. For a while, they just watched the fire. Margaret noticed Ethan's face illuminated in the orange glow. Thoughtful. Calm, maybe even at peace. Then he turned toward her and said softly, Grandma, I think I've been so afraid of losing people that I forgot how to just love them. Her heart ached at his honesty. She reached out and took his hand. Then love them now, she said, before the fear gets too loud. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. You always make things sound so simple. That's because love is simple, she said gently. It's people who make it complicated. The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, the night deepened, and a few stars began to appear. The fire burned lower, but the warmth between them remained steady. Then, almost hesitantly, Ethan spoke again. Grandma, when you look at me, do you ever think about Grandpa? She blinked, surprised. Sometimes, she admitted. You have his kindness and his eyes. You remind me that love doesn't really end. It just changes shape. He smiled faintly. Maybe that's why I feel close to him here. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't look away. Then I think he's close to you too. The house fell into a comfortable silence again. The fire flickered. The wind whispered against the windows, and in that quiet space, time felt slower, softer, later. When Ethan went to bed, Margaret stayed by the fire. She looked at the empty chair beside her and whispered, "You'd be proud of him, Henry. He's learning what love really means." The next morning, the sun rose bright and clear. Margaret woke to find Ethan already in the kitchen making pancakes. "Well, look at you," she said, smiling. "You've learned something new," he laughed. "Trying to pay you back for all the good meals." They ate together, light conversation filling the air. It felt like a new beginning, not dramatic or grand, just simple and honest. After breakfast, Ethan packed his bags. It was time for him to go back home. Margaret tried not to let the sadness show on her face. "You'll come visit again soon?" she asked. "Of course," he said, hugging her tightly. "And you have to promise to take care of yourself." She chuckled softly. "I've been doing that a long time." He pulled back and smiled. "But still promise." "I promise," she said warmly. As he drove away, she stood on the porch watching his car disappear down the long road. The house grew quiet again, but it didn't feel empty this time. It felt full of warmth, memory, and the kind of love that doesn't fade when someone leaves that night. Margaret sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars appear. She thought of Ethan's words, the calm he said he felt with her, and realized he had given her something too. He had reminded her that love doesn't just come from the past. It lives in the present, in every shared meal, every conversation, every gentle silence. She closed her eyes, letting the night breeze touch her face. Somewhere in the quiet, she could almost hear Henry's voice, not in sorrow, but in peace. "See?" It seemed to say, "You were never alone." Margaret smiled, her heart steady and light. The world around her was quiet, but inside, it was full of the echoes of love that never really leave. And as the night deepened, she whispered softly into the stars, "He's going to be all right." She didn't need an answer. She already knew.